when the air raid sirens began wailing across our suburban Philadelphia neighborhood on that terrifying October morning in 1962, my 11-year-old best friend Susan Parker grabbed my hand so tightly that her fingernails left permanent half-moon marks on my palm. And we both knew with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to children that the world as we knew it was about to end. That the grown-ups who were supposed to protect us had failed completely, and that we might have only minutes left to live before the Soviet missiles that President Kennedy had discovered in Cuba turned our entire country into a radioactive wasteland where nothing would ever grow again. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 90 years old now, and I have spent the last 61 years trying to understand how 13 days in October of 1962 could leave such permanent scars on an entire generation of American children. How the fear of nuclear annihilation could burrow so deep into young minds that it would shape every decision we made for the rest of our lives. How my best friend Susan Parker could go from being the bravest, most adventurous girl I knew to someone who would spend decades afraid of her own shadow, jumping at every unexpected sound, unable to trust that tomorrow would actually come because she had learned at age 11 that the world could end without warning. If you are watching this from a time when children don't have to practice hiding under their school desks because adults with nuclear weapons might decide to destroy civilization, please take a moment to comment where you are watching from. Because I need to know that there are young people somewhere who get to grow up without the constant fear that defined my generation, who can plan for the future without wondering if there will be one, who can sleep peacefully without listening for the sirens that might give them 4 minutes to say goodbye to everything they love. And if you lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis as a child, if you remember the duck and cover drills and the fallout shelter advertisements and the way adults suddenly stopped smiling when the news came on, please comment the number 13. If you understand what it means to have your innocence destroyed by the realization that the grown-ups who were supposed to keep you safe were actually the ones creating the danger. Because sometimes knowing that others share this particular kind of childhood trauma is the only thing that makes it feel bearable. The only thing that validates the fear that has lived in our hearts for 6 decades and shows us that we weren't crazy or weak or oversensitive. We were just children trying to make sense of a world that had gone completely insane. But this story begins much earlier than October 1962. Back in 1956, when Susan Parker moved into the house next door to ours on Maple Street in the quiet Philadelphia suburb of Ardmore. And she was 5 years old with pigtails that never stayed neat and a smile that could light up the entire neighborhood. The kind of fearless child who would climb the tallest trees and explore the deepest parts of the woods behind our houses, and who made me braver just by being my friend, just by assuming that adventure was always possible and danger was just something that made life more interesting. Susan's family had moved from Iowa because her father, Robert Parker, had taken a job with a defense contractor that was working on something he could never talk about, something classified that required security clearances and frequent trips to Washington, and a kind of grim seriousness that seemed to hang over their house like a permanent cloud, as if the Parkers knew secrets that the rest of us couldn't handle, as if they understood threats that hadn't yet occurred to our parents who still believed that America was safe, that oceans protected us from the kinds of wars that happened to other countries, that the future would be better than the past because that's how progress worked. Even as young children, Susan and I could sense that something was different about the world we were growing up in, something that our parents' generation hadn't had to deal with when they were our age, though we couldn't have articulated what that something was or why it made the adults around us seem so anxious all the time, why they spoke in hushed tones when they thought we weren't listening, why they spent so much time watching the news and shaking their heads and exchanging worried glances that suggested they knew something terrible was coming, but couldn't figure out how to protect us from it. The 1950s were supposed to be a time of prosperity and optimism, of suburban dreams coming true and American families living happily in houses with white picket fences, but underneath all that surface contentment was a kind of existential dread that infected everything. A fear that all the material success and technological progress could be wiped out in minutes by weapons that were too terrible to imagine and too real to ignore. We were the first generation of children to grow up with the knowledge that human beings had invented a way to destroy themselves completely, that somewhere in the world were bombs powerful enough to end civilization, and that the people who controlled those bombs might use them at any moment for reasons we couldn't understand. Susan seemed to absorb this anxiety more deeply than most children. Perhaps because her father's work kept him so close to the military-industrial complex that was both protecting America and threatening to destroy it, or perhaps because she was simply more sensitive to the emotional currents that flowed through our community like an underground river of fear that most adults tried to pretend didn't exist. She would wake up from nightmares about mushroom clouds and fallout and cities full of dead people, and she would call me on the phone in the middle of the night, whispering into the receiver because she didn't want her parents to know how scared she was, how the things they thought they were hiding from her were actually the only things she could think about. Our friendship was built around shared adventures and innocent mischief, the kind of childhood bond that forms when two people discover they can be completely themselves with each other without fear of judgment or rejection. But it was also shaped by the particular anxieties of our historical moment, by the knowledge that we were living through something unprecedented in human history, something that required a kind of courage that children shouldn't have to develop. We created elaborate games based on survival scenarios, building forts in the woods that we pretended were fallout shelters, practicing living on canned goods and rainwater, imagining what we would do if the bombs fell and we were the only ones left alive. These games were simultaneously playful and deadly serious, reflecting our need to process fears that the adult world wasn't helping us understand, to gain some sense of control over scenarios that were completely beyond our control, to practice being brave in situations where bravery might be the only thing that could save us. Susan was always the leader in these games, the one who came up with the most elaborate plans and the most detailed survival strategies. And I realize now that she was trying to master her fear by turning it into something she could manage, something she could prepare for, something that wouldn't catch her completely helpless and defenseless. The duck and cover drills at school began when Susan and I were in 3rd grade, and they immediately became the most terrifying part of our education, more frightening than any horror movie or ghost story because they were real, because they were preparation for something that might actually happen, because the adults who taught us these procedures looked genuinely scared when they explained what we were supposed to do. If we saw a bright flash of light, that meant a nuclear bomb was exploding somewhere nearby. The drills themselves were almost comically inadequate, hiding under our desks and covering our heads with our hands, as if wood and paper could protect us from weapons that could level entire cities. But the message they sent was crystal clear. We were living in a world where children needed to know how to respond to nuclear attack, where the possibility of mass destruction was so real that it had to be incorporated into elementary school curricula. Susan took these drills more seriously than anyone else in our class, practicing the positions at home, timing how quickly she could get under her desk, asking our teacher, Mrs. Henderson, detailed questions about radiation and fallout that made the poor woman turn pale and stammer responses that satisfied no one, because there were no satisfying answers to questions about how Children were supposed to survive nuclear war. The other kids in our class treated the drills like a game, giggling and pushing each other and generally behaving the way children behave when they're asked to do something that doesn't make sense to them. But Susan approached them with the kind of grim determination usually reserved for much older people who understand that their lives depend on following instructions exactly. I remember one particular drill in 4th grade when the alarm bell rang and we all dove under our desks as we had been taught. But instead of getting back up after the usual minute or two, we stayed there for what felt like hours, while Mrs. Henderson stood at the window looking out at the playground with an expression of genuine panic on her face. And we realized that this wasn't a drill at all, but a real alert, that something was actually happening that might require us to hide from nuclear attack. The silence under those desks was unlike anything I had ever experienced, filled with the kind of fear that makes time stretch and distort, makes every heartbeat sound like thunder, makes you suddenly understand that you might be living the last moments of your life. It turned out to be a false alarm, a malfunction in the emergency broadcast system that had triggered alerts throughout the Delaware Valley. But the damage was already done to our young psyches. The understanding that the drills weren't just theoretical exercises, but preparation for real events that could happen at any moment without warning. Susan never quite recovered from that afternoon under the desk, from the realization that the adults who were supposed to protect us were just as scared and helpless as we were, that all our preparation and all our precautions might not be enough to save us from forces that were completely beyond our comprehension or control. The Cuban Missile Crisis began for us on Monday, October 15, 1962, though we wouldn't understand what was happening until much later, when President Kennedy addressed the nation on television and told us that Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles had been discovered in Cuba, just 90 miles from the Florida coast, capable of reaching most of the United States within minutes, carrying nuclear warheads that could kill millions of Americans and plunge the world into a war that would make all previous wars look like playground disputes. But even before the official announcement, we could sense that something catastrophic was building, could feel the tension in our parents' voices when they thought we weren't listening, could see the fear in their eyes when they watched the evening news. Susan's father had been working longer hours than usual that week, coming home late with his face gray with exhaustion and worry, carrying briefcases that he locked in his study and classified documents that he burned in their backyard incinerator after reading them. And Susan had overheard enough phone conversations to know that whatever he was working on was connected to something happening in Cuba, something that required immediate attention from people with security clearances high enough to know about America's most sensitive military secrets. The weekend before Kennedy's address, Susan and I were playing in her backyard when we noticed unusual activity in the skies above our neighborhood. Military aircraft flying in formations that we had never seen before, jets that left contrails at altitudes that seemed higher than normal civilian air traffic. And when we asked Susan's father about them, his face went pale, and he told us not to worry about things we couldn't understand. But his tone suggested that we should worry about them very much, that whatever was happening was serious enough to require the kind of military mobilization that only occurred during national emergencies. Monday evening, October 22nd, 1962, President Kennedy appeared on television to deliver what would later be recognized as one of the most important speeches in American history, and Susan and I watched it with our families in the Parkers' living room, sitting on the carpet in front of their new RCA television set while our parents occupied the chairs and sofas behind us. And even though we were only 11 years old, we understood immediately that we were witnessing a turning point in human history. A moment when the future of civilization would be decided by men in suits, sitting in rooms far away from our suburban neighborhood, but close enough to our nuclear missiles to end our lives within minutes of making their decisions. Kennedy's voice was steady and reassuring, but his words were terrifying, describing a nuclear crisis that was unfolding just miles from our shores, explaining that Soviet ships were carrying missiles to Cuba that could strike American cities with virtually no warning, announcing a naval quarantine that might provoke a war between the two most heavily armed nations in human history. And Susan grabbed my hand with that same desperate grip that would become her signature response to fear, her fingernails digging into my palm as if holding on to me could somehow anchor her to a world that suddenly felt like it was spinning out of control. The 13 days that followed Kennedy's speech were the longest 2 weeks in human history, a period when the world came closer to nuclear war than it had ever been before or would ever be again, when every morning felt like it might be the last morning we would ever see, and every evening felt like a miracle because we had survived another day without the missiles launching, and the bombs falling and civilization ending in a flash of light brighter than the sun. Susan and I spent those days in a state of constant hypervigilance, listening to every radio broadcast, watching every news report, analyzing every expression on every adult face for signs that might tell us whether we were going to live or die. The fear was unlike anything either of us had ever experienced. Not the manageable fear of monsters under the bed or getting in trouble at school, but the existential terror that comes from understanding that forces completely beyond your control might decide at any moment to end your life and the lives of everyone you love, that you might have minutes or hours or days left to live, and there was absolutely nothing you could do to influence the outcome. We were 11 years old, still young enough to believe that adults could fix any problem, still innocent enough to assume that the grown-ups who ran the world were wise and careful and committed to protecting children like us. And the Cuban Missile Crisis shattered those assumptions completely and permanently. Susan's reaction to the crisis was immediate and intense, a kind of psychological collapse that manifested as physical symptoms that her parents initially attributed to a stomach bug or seasonal allergies, but that I recognized as pure terror, the kind of fear that makes your body rebel against the very idea of continuing to exist in a world that has become too dangerous to inhabit. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped participating in the normal activities of childhood, spending her days huddled in her bedroom, listening to news broadcasts on a transistor radio that she kept tuned to emergency frequencies, waiting for the alert that would tell us we had minutes to live. I would find her some morning sitting on her bedroom floor surrounded by maps and newspapers, trying to calculate how long it would take for Soviet missiles to reach Philadelphia, how much warning we might have, whether our basement would provide adequate protection from radiation, whether we should try to evacuate to her grandmother's farm in rural Pennsylvania, or stay in our suburban neighborhood where emergency services might be better organized. These were not the concerns of a normal 11-year-old girl, but nothing about our situation was normal. And Susan was responding to abnormal circumstances in ways that made perfect sense to me, even as they terrified me, because I could see how completely the fear was consuming her. The duck and cover drills at school became more frequent during the crisis, sometimes 2 or 3 times per day, and each one sent Susan into a state of panic that took longer and longer to subside, as if each practice session was reinforcing her certainty that nuclear war was not just possible but inevitable, that we were practicing for something that was definitely going to happen rather than something that might happen. She would crouch under her desk with her hands clasped over her head and her eyes squeezed shut, and I could see her lips moving in what I later realized were prayers. Desperate bargains with God to please not let the bombs fall today, to please give us just a little more time to grow up and fall in love and have the lives we had been planning before the world went crazy. Our teacher, Mrs. Henderson, tried to maintain some sense of normalcy during those impossible weeks, continuing with regular lessons about arithmetic and spelling and American history. But it was clear that her heart wasn't in it, that she was as terrified as we were and struggling to hide her own fears from students who needed her to be strong and confident and reassuring. She would glance at the classroom door whenever footsteps passed in the hallway, would jump at unexpected sounds, would pause in the middle of sentences as if she were listening for something that the rest of us couldn't hear, and her anxiety was contagious, spreading through the classroom like a virus that infected everyone with the same desperate need to know what was happening in the adult world that was making all the decisions about our future. The nights were the worst part of the crisis for Susan, when the news broadcasts ended and there was nothing to distract her from the thoughts that circled through her mind like vultures. Thoughts about mushroom clouds and radiation sickness, and what it would feel like to die in a nuclear explosion. Whether it would be quick and painless or slow and agonizing, whether we would have time to say goodbye to our parents or would simply be vaporized without warning while we slept in our beds. She would call me after her parents had gone to sleep, whispering into the phone about her nightmares and her fears and her certainty that we were all going to die before we had a chance to really live. I tried to be comforting and reassuring, to tell her that everything would be okay, that President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev were smart men who wouldn't let the situation escalate into actual war. But my own fear made my reassurances sound hollow and unconvincing, and I think Susan could hear in my voice the same terror that was consuming her, the same desperate hope that if we just held on long enough, if we just got through one more day and then another, maybe the adults would figure out how to solve this problem without killing us all. We were children trying to comfort each other about adult problems that shouldn't have been our responsibility to understand, let alone survive, and the inadequacy of our resources for dealing with such enormous stakes was both heartbreaking and inevitable. Susan's parents tried to shield her from the worst of the news coverage, but in 1962 there was no way to completely protect children from information about world events that might directly affect their survival, and Susan was too intelligent and too observant to be fooled by adult attempts to downplay the seriousness of what was happening. She could read the fear in her father's face when he came home from work, could hear the anxiety in her mother's voice when she talked on the phone with relatives in other states, could sense the way the entire adult world was holding its breath and waiting for someone to make a mistake that would end everything. The false alarms during those 13 days were almost worse than the actual crisis. Moments when emergency sirens would sound for tests or malfunctions, and we would think that this was it, that the missiles were actually in the air and we had minutes to live, that all our preparation and all our fear had been justified, and now we would find out whether hiding under school desks would actually save us from nuclear weapons. Susan would freeze during these alarms, unable to move or speak or follow the procedures we had practiced, and I would have to physically pull her under our desk and hold her there while she shook with terror that seemed to come from someplace deeper than rational fear, from some primitive part of her brain that understood that this was how the world ended. Not with a whimper, but with children cowering under furniture that couldn't protect them from anything. The radio became Susan's constant companion during the crisis, a small transistor radio that she carried everywhere, tuned to news stations that provided updates on the naval quarantine and the diplomatic negotiations and the military preparations that were happening on both sides of what felt like an inevitable conflict. She would sit with that radio pressed to her ear like other children might hold a favorite stuffed animal, desperate for any information that might give her some sense of control over a situation that was completely beyond her influence, some advance warning that might allow her to prepare for whatever was coming next. I remember one afternoon when we were walking home from school and the radio announced that Soviet ships were approaching the quarantine line established by the U.S. Navy, that they would reach the point of confrontation within hours, that military commanders on both sides were preparing for the possibility of armed conflict that could escalate into full-scale nuclear war. And Susan collapsed right there on the sidewalk, overwhelmed by the realization that this might be the day when everything ended, when all our fears proved justified and all our preparations proved inadequate. I sat with her on the cold concrete while she sobbed with the kind of grief that comes from losing something precious before you've even had a chance to enjoy it. Grieving for the future that might be stolen from us by men who had never met us, but who had the power to decide whether we lived or died. The neighborhood where we lived during the Cuban Missile Crisis was a microcosm of America during those terrifying weeks, filled with families who were trying to maintain some sense of normalcy while preparing for the possibility of nuclear war. People who were going to work and school and church as if nothing had changed, while also stockpiling canned goods and building fallout shelters and having conversations about evacuation routes and survival, strategies that no one had ever expected to need. The contradiction between normal suburban life and nuclear terror created a kind of cognitive dissonance that was particularly hard on children, who couldn't understand how adults could continue with routine activities when the world might end at any moment. Susan's family had always been more prepared than most for the possibility of nuclear war, partly because her father's work gave him access to information about Soviet capabilities that wasn't available to the general public, and partly because they had lived through enough military crises to understand that the Cold War wasn't just a political abstraction, but a real conflict with real weapons that could really kill them. Their basement had been converted into a fallout shelter years before the Cuban Missile Crisis, stocked with canned food and water purification tablets and radiation detectors and all the other supplies that civil defense authorities recommended for families who wanted to survive nuclear attack. During the 13 days of the crisis, that basement became Susan's refuge, the place where she felt safest, the only location where she could imagine surviving whatever was coming next. And she would spend hours down there among the emergency supplies, reading civil defense pamphlets about radiation sickness and fallout patterns, calculating how long the food and water would last, planning for scenarios that no 11-year-old should have to consider. The basement was cold and damp and filled with the kind of oppressive atmosphere that comes from being underground. But for Susan, it represented safety in a world that had become completely unsafe. The only place where she felt like she had any control over her own survival. I would join her in that basement sometimes, and we would sit among the emergency supplies and talk about what we would do if the bombs actually fell. How we would ration the food, how we would know when it was safe to come out, how we would rebuild civilization if everyone else was dead and we were among the few survivors. These conversations were simultaneously practical and fantastical, a mixture of genuine emergency planning and childhood imagination. But they served an important psychological function for Susan, giving her a sense of agency in a situation where children had no agency at all, allowing her to feel like she was preparing for something rather than just passively waiting for someone else to decide her fate. The most terrifying moment of the Cuban Missile Crisis for Susan came on Saturday, October 27th, when a Soviet surface-to-air missile shot down an American U-2 spy plane over Cuba, killing the pilot and bringing the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been before or would ever be again. Because military commanders on both sides were interpreting the downing of the aircraft as an act of war that might require immediate retaliation, and only the personal intervention of President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev prevented their subordinates from launching attacks that would have escalated into global thermonuclear conflict within hours. We didn't know the specific details of what was happening at the highest levels of government, but we could feel the tension ratcheting up to unbearable levels, could sense that the crisis was reaching some kind of climax that would determine whether we lived or died, whether civilization continued or ended, whether the children of 1962 would grow up to have children of their own or would be vaporized in nuclear fireballs that would turn cities into radioactive wastelands. Susan spent that entire day in her family's fallout shelter, convinced that war was imminent, that this was the day when all our worst fears would be realized, when the missiles would fly and the bombs would fall and everything we had ever known would be destroyed in minutes. I found her that evening huddled in the corner of the basement, clutching her transistor radio and rocking back and forth like someone in severe psychological distress. And when I tried to talk to her, she could barely respond coherently, could barely acknowledge my presence. So completely consumed was she by terror that felt rational and justified and impossible to comfort. She had passed beyond normal fear into something approaching catatonia, a psychological shutdown that seemed like her mind's way of protecting itself from realities too terrible to process. And I realized that even if we survived the Cuban Missile Crisis, even if the world stepped back from nuclear war, Susan might never fully recover from the trauma of those 13 days when everything we had believed about safety and security and the basic rationality of the adult world had been revealed to be illusions. The crisis ended on Sunday, October 28th, when Premier Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for American guarantees not to invade the island and secret agreements to remove American missiles from Turkey. But for Susan, the end of the immediate threat didn't mean the end of the fear, didn't restore her faith that the world was a safe place for children, didn't convince her that the adults who made decisions about war and peace could be trusted to protect the innocent people who would suffer the consequences of their choices. The official resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis was greeted with relief throughout America, with newspaper headlines celebrating the triumph of diplomacy over warfare, with politicians claiming credit for avoiding nuclear catastrophe, with ordinary families trying to return to normal life as if the previous 2 weeks had been just a brief interruption in the normal course of suburban prosperity and happiness. But for the children who had lived through those 13 days with the constant awareness that they might be among the last human beings ever to be born, that they might die before they had a chance to experience love or achievement, or any of the things that make life worth living, the crisis left permanent scars that would never fully heal. Susan's immediate reaction to the end of the crisis was not relief, but something closer to emotional exhaustion, the kind of collapse that follows prolonged periods of extreme stress, when the body and mind finally allow themselves to acknowledge how close they came to complete breakdown and how much energy it took just to keep functioning during the worst of the emergency. She slept for almost 24 hours straight after Khrushchev's announcement, as if her consciousness needed that much time to process what had happened and to begin the long work of recovery from trauma that would define the rest of her childhood and much of her adult life. When Susan finally emerged from that marathon sleep, she seemed like a different person, older and more serious, and permanently changed by her encounter with the possibility of nuclear annihilation. No longer the fearless, adventurous child who had climbed trees and explored forests and assumed that the future would be filled with exciting possibilities. The Cuban Missile Crisis had aged her in ways that couldn't be measured in years, had given her knowledge about human nature and political power, and the fragility of civilization that most people don't acquire until much later in life, if they acquire it at all. The months following the crisis were marked by Susan's gradual withdrawal from many of the activities and friendships that had previously defined her life, as if she had decided that investing too much in relationships or plans or hopes for the future was dangerous, that caring too much about anything made you vulnerable to the kind of devastating loss that nuclear war would represent. She became obsessed with emergency preparedness, with survival skills, with detailed knowledge about fallout patterns and radiation sickness and all the other technical aspects of nuclear warfare that most children her age were content to ignore. Susan's parents tried to help her process what she had experienced during the crisis, taking her to therapists and counselors who specialized in childhood trauma, but the mental health profession in 1962 had limited understanding of how to treat children who had been traumatized by global political events rather than personal family crises. And most of the professional advice they received focused on returning Susan to normal childhood activities rather than addressing the underlying reality that had caused her trauma in the first place. The problem was that Susan's fear wasn't irrational or pathological, but perfectly logical and appropriate given the actual circumstances of the Cold War, given the real existence of nuclear weapons that could destroy civilization, given the demonstrated willingness of political leaders to bring the world to the brink of nuclear war over issues that had nothing to do with the safety or well-being of ordinary people like us. How do you treat a child for being afraid of something that really is terrifying, that really could kill her, that really is largely beyond her control? How do you convince someone that their perfectly rational assessment of existential danger should be replaced with the kind of naive optimism that allows most people to function in a world where nuclear weapons exist but where most individuals choose not to think about them most of the time? The duck and cover drills continued at our school throughout the rest of the 1960s, but they took on a different quality after the Cuban Missile Crisis, becoming less frequent and more routine, treated by most students and teachers as bureaucratic requirements rather than urgent preparation for likely scenarios. But Susan never stopped taking them seriously, never stopped approaching each drill as if it might be the real thing, never stopped believing that nuclear war was not just possible but probable, and that we needed to be ready for it at all times. She would time herself getting under her desk, would critique the positioning of other students, would ask Mrs. Henderson questions about fallout and radiation. That made our teacher visibly uncomfortable because the answers weren't reassuring and weren't appropriate for children who were supposed to be learning about reading and arithmetic and American history. I remained Susan's closest friend throughout our middle school and high school years, but our relationship was increasingly defined by her need for constant reassurance about nuclear threats and my inability to provide the kind of comfort she needed. Because I couldn't promise her that the world was safe when it obviously wasn't, couldn't convince her that nuclear war wouldn't happen when it had already almost happened, couldn't restore her faith in adult wisdom and protection. When the Cuban Missile Crisis had demonstrated so clearly that the people in charge of our survival were fallible and frightened, and capable of making mistakes that could end civilization, Susan's academic performance, which had been excellent before the crisis, became erratic and unfocused, not because she wasn't intelligent, but because she found it difficult to concentrate on subjects that seemed irrelevant compared to the existential. threats that she believed were constantly looming over our heads. Why memorize multiplication tables when nuclear war might make all human knowledge irrelevant within hours? Why study American history when American civilization might not survive long enough for that history to matter? Why plan for college and careers and families when there might not be a future for any of those things? These questions, which Susan asked frequently and seriously, revealed a kind of logical thinking that was both mature and devastating. The reasoning of someone who had been forced to confront ultimate realities at an age when most children are protected from such considerations, and I began to understand that the Cuban Missile Crisis had given Susan a perspective on life that was simultaneously more realistic and more paralyzing than the perspectives held by people who managed to function normally despite living in a nuclear world. She saw clearly what most of us preferred to ignore, but seeing clearly made it almost impossible for her to live normally. The social dynamics of our adolescence were shaped by Susan's reputation as the girl who was obsessed with nuclear war, who could discuss fallout patterns and missile ranges and civil defense protocols with the expertise of a military analyst, who kept emergency supplies in her locker and practiced survival skills during lunch breaks, who treated every international crisis as a potential trigger for World War III, and who couldn't understand why other teenagers seemed so unconcerned about threats that she considered immediate and urgent. She became isolated and marginalized, not because people disliked her personally, but because her constant focus on catastrophic possibilities made her difficult to be around, made ordinary teenage concerns seem trivial and foolish, made everyone uncomfortable with reminders of realities they were trying not to think about. I tried to maintain our friendship despite the social costs, partly because I loved Susan and remembered who she had been before the crisis damaged her so severely, and partly because I recognized that her fears were rational, even if her responses to those fears were making her life unlivable. But it became increasingly difficult to spend time with someone whose entire worldview was organized around the expectation of imminent nuclear annihilation, whose every conversation eventually turned to discussions of survival strategies and emergency preparations and the various ways that civilization might end. Our high school years, from 1966 to 1970, were marked by a series of international crises that triggered Susan's nuclear anxiety and sent her into periods of intense preparation and panic that disrupted her education and her relationships and her ability to participate in normal teenage activities. The Six-Day War in 1967, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, the escalation of the Vietnam War throughout the late 60s. Each of these events convinced Susan that nuclear conflict was becoming more likely, that the temporary resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis had only postponed an inevitable confrontation between the superpowers, that she needed to be ready for the war that would end all wars. Susan's bedroom became a kind of command center for monitoring global threats, filled with maps and newspapers and radio equipment that she used to track international developments that might indicate increasing nuclear risks, and she developed an encyclopedic knowledge of military technology and nuclear strategy that would have been impressive in a graduate student but was deeply disturbing in a teenage girl who should have been thinking about prom, dresses and college applications and first dates instead of throwaways and delivery, systems and mutually assured destruction. Her parents, who had initially supported her interest in emergency preparedness as a reasonable response to legitimate threats, became increasingly concerned about the way her focus on nuclear warfare was consuming her entire life, preventing her from developing normal social relationships and academic interests and plans for the future, that didn't revolve around surviving atomic war. They consulted with more therapists and counselors, tried various medications that were supposed to reduce anxiety, enrolled her in activities that were designed to help her connect with peers who shared other interests. But nothing seemed to help because Susan's problem wasn't psychological instability, but logical consistency, the natural result of taking seriously threats that most people managed to ignore through psychological defense mechanisms that she either couldn't or wouldn't employ. The anti-war protests that swept through American colleges and high schools during the late 1960s provided Susan with her first opportunity to channel her nuclear anxiety into political action, to connect her personal fears about atomic warfare with broader movements that were challenging American military policies and questioning the assumptions that had led to the Cold War confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. She became involved with peace organizations and anti-nuclear groups, attending rallies and marches and teach-ins where she could discuss her concerns with other people who shared her belief that nuclear weapons represented an unacceptable threat to human survival. But even within the peace movement, Susan's intensity and expertise made her somewhat isolated, because most anti-war activists were focused on specific conflicts like Vietnam rather than on the broader existential questions that dominated her thinking. And because her detailed knowledge of nuclear weapon systems and civil defense protocols made her conversations more technical and frightening than the kinds of discussions that most people wanted to have about war and peace. She became known as the girl who knew too much about nuclear warfare, who could explain exactly what would happen if hydrogen bombs exploded over American cities, who had calculated how many megatons of explosive power were pointed at various targets throughout the United States, and who understood the strategic implications of different weapon systems in ways that made abstract political discussion suddenly concrete and terrifying. Susan graduated from high school in 1970 with grades that were good enough for college admission, but without the kind of clear plans for the future that characterized most of her classmates, because she found it difficult to make long-term commitments when she believed that long-term planning might be pointless, that the future she was supposed to be preparing for might not exist, that any investment in education or career development or personal relationships might be wasted if nuclear war occurred before she had a chance to benefit from those investments. She enrolled at Temple University in Philadelphia, partly because it was close to home and partly because their political science program included courses on international relations and military strategy that allowed her to study formally the subjects that had been her obsession since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But her college experience was marked by the same social isolation and academic inconsistency that had characterized her high school years, the same inability to connect with peers who didn't share her preoccupation with nuclear threats, the same difficulty concentrating on subjects that seemed irrelevant compared to questions of human survival in the atomic age. I went to Penn State, far enough from Philadelphia that I could begin to establish an identity that wasn't defined by my relationship with Susan and her nuclear anxieties. And for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, I began to understand what normal teenage development might have looked like if we hadn't spent our formative years expecting to die in atomic warfare. College introduced me to people who had grown up in different parts of the country, who had experienced the Cold War differently, who had managed to maintain optimism and ambition and faith in the future, despite living in the same nuclear world that had traumatized Susan so severely. But even as I was discovering what normal life might look like, I remained connected to Susan through letters and phone calls and visits that reminded me constantly of the fears that had shaped our childhood, the trauma that had defined our friendship, The ways that historical events beyond our control had damaged someone I loved and cared about, someone whose suffering seemed both unnecessary and inevitable, given the realities of nuclear proliferation and Cold War confrontation that continued to threaten human civilization. Susan's letters from college were filled with detailed analyses of nuclear strategy and arms control negotiations, discussions of throw weights and delivery systems and targeting strategies that revealed both her sophisticated understanding of military technology and her continued obsession with scenarios that most college students managed to avoid thinking about most of the time. She wrote about professors who were uncomfortable with her questions about nuclear warfare, about classmates who thought she was paranoid or obsessive, about the difficulty of maintaining romantic relationships with people who didn't understand why she needed to keep emergency supplies in her dormitory room and why she couldn't make plans more than a few months in advance. The early 1970s were marked by détente between the United States and the Soviet Union, by arms control agreements that were supposed to reduce nuclear risks, by diplomatic initiatives that suggested the possibility of peaceful coexistence between the superpowers. But Susan interpreted these developments with skepticism rather than relief, arguing that temporary improvements in superpower relations didn't eliminate the fundamental threat posed by the existence of nuclear weapons, that arms control treaties were just management strategies for arsenals that remained capable of destroying civilization, that détente was a tactical pause in a strategic confrontation that would eventually resume with even more dangerous weapons and higher stakes. Her analysis of nuclear politics was sophisticated and often prescient, anticipating developments that wouldn't become obvious to most observers for several more years. But her inability to find hope or comfort in any positive developments made her increasingly isolated from friends and family who wanted to believe that the world was becoming safer, that the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis had taught political leaders to be more careful about nuclear risks, that technological progress and diplomatic wisdom would eventually solve the problems that had traumatized our generation. Susan dropped out of college after 3 years, not because she was academically unsuccessful, but because she found it impossible to pursue long-term educational goals when she believed that civilization might not survive long enough to make those goals meaningful, and she moved back to her parents' house in Ardmore, where she spent most of her time monitoring international developments and updating the emergency preparations that had been her primary focus since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Her parents were devastated by her decision to abandon her education, but they also recognized that forcing her to continue with college would probably be counterproductive given her mental state and her conviction that formal education was irrelevant compared to survival skills. I graduated from Penn State in 1974 with a degree in elementary education and began teaching 3rd grade in a suburban Philadelphia school district, trying to create for my students the kind of safe and nurturing educational environment that Susan and I had been denied during our own elementary school years, when duck and cover drills and nuclear anxiety had made learning difficult and childhood innocence almost impossible to maintain. I was determined not to let another generation of children be traumatized by adult fears about nuclear warfare, to protect them from the kinds of existential anxieties that had damaged Susan so severely, to help them develop confidence and optimism about the future, despite living in a world that remained dangerous and unpredictable. But even as I was trying to create positive educational experiences for my students, I remained haunted by Susan's continuing struggle with nuclear anxiety, by her inability to recover from trauma that had occurred more than a decade earlier, by the way that 13 days in October 1962 continued to dominate her life and prevent her from experiencing the normal pleasures and satisfactions of young adulthood. She had become a kind of living memorial to the psychological casualties of the Cold War, a reminder of how political conflicts between nations could destroy individual lives even when those conflicts stopped short of actual warfare. Susan's adult life was marked by a series of relationships that ended when her partners couldn't tolerate her obsession with nuclear threats, her need to discuss survival strategies instead of normal couple activities, her inability to make long-term plans or commitments, because she remained convinced that nuclear war was not just possible but probable, and that preparing for it should take precedence over other activities and relationships. She worked a series of part-time jobs that allowed her to spend most of her time monitoring international developments and updating her emergency preparations. But she never found a career that felt meaningful compared to what she considered the only work that really mattered: preparing for nuclear war. The late 1970s and early 1980s brought new nuclear crises that triggered Susan's anxiety and confirmed her belief that the Cuban Missile Crisis had been just the first in a series of confrontations that would eventually lead to actual nuclear warfare, that each crisis brought the world closer to the catastrophic war that would end human civilization, that her constant vigilance and preparation were justified by developments that proved how fragile peace really was when it depended on the wisdom and restraint of political leaders who had already demonstrated their willingness to risk everything for strategic advantage. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the breakdown of détente during the final years of the Carter administration, the election of Ronald Reagan with his rhetoric about winning nuclear wars, and his massive military buildup during the early 1980s. Each of these developments sent Susan into periods of intense anxiety and preparation that disrupted whatever stability she had managed to achieve in her personal life, confirming her worst fears about the trajectory of superpower relations and the likelihood of nuclear conflict. The nuclear freeze movement of the early 1980s provided Susan with another opportunity to channel her fears into political activism, and she became deeply involved with organizations that were working to halt the nuclear arms race and reduce the risks of accidental or intentional nuclear war. But even within the peace movement, she remained isolated by the intensity of her commitment and the depth of her knowledge about nuclear weapon systems, which made her more effective as an activist but also more disturbing as a person to spend time with socially. Susan's expertise about nuclear strategy and weapons technology made her a valuable resource for peace organizations that needed people who could explain complex technical issues to audiences of concerned citizens, and she became a frequent speaker at rallies and teach-ins and congressional hearings where her detailed knowledge and personal passion could be used to educate people about nuclear risks that most Americans preferred not to think about. Her presentations were invariably powerful and convincing, filled with technical details and strategic analysis that revealed both her sophisticated understanding of nuclear issues and her deep personal investment in preventing the kind of war that had haunted her since childhood. But Susan's public success as a nuclear analyst and peace activist couldn't compensate for her private struggles with relationships and personal fulfillment, couldn't give her the kind of normal life experiences that she had been denied by her obsession with nuclear threats, couldn't restore the confidence and optimism about the future that the Cuban Missile Crisis had stolen from her when she was 11 years old. She remained brilliant and committed and effective in her chosen field, but she also remained isolated and anxious and unable to enjoy the ordinary pleasures of adult life because she couldn't stop thinking about the extraordinary dangers that threatened human survival. The Reagan military buildup of the early 1980s, which included deployment of intermediate-range missiles in Europe and development of new strategic weapon systems that increased both the accuracy and the destructive power of nuclear arsenals, triggered the most severe episode of nuclear anxiety that Susan had experienced since the Cuban Missile Crisis itself, and she spent those years in a state of almost constant panic, convinced that nuclear war was becoming more likely every day, that the arms race was spinning out of control, that the world was approaching another confrontation that might not be resolved as peacefully as the 1962 crisis had been. The November 1983 NATO exercise Able Archer 83, which simulated nuclear warfare in Europe, and which Soviet leaders apparently interpreted as preparation for an actual first strike, brought Susan to the edge of complete psychological breakdown, because she understood better than most civilians how close the world had come to nuclear war during exercises that were supposed to be just training, but that had been misinterpreted by paranoid Soviet leaders as preparation for real attack. The fact that the world had almost stumbled into nuclear war through miscommunication and misunderstanding rather than deliberate policy. Decisions confirmed Susan's worst fears about the unpredictability of nuclear risks and the inadequacy of arms control measures that couldn't prevent accidental warfare. I tried to maintain our friendship throughout these decades of crisis and recovery, visiting Susan regularly and talking with her on the phone and trying to provide emotional support for someone whose suffering seemed both preventable and intractable, whose trauma from childhood had become a permanent condition that shaped every aspect of her adult life, whose rational understanding of nuclear risks had become an irrational obsession that prevented her from functioning normally in a world where most people managed to live with nuclear threats without being paralyzed by them. But it was increasingly difficult to help someone whose problems were rooted not in personal psychology, but in political realities, whose fears were justified by actual weapons that could actually destroy civilization, whose response to nuclear threats was logical even if it was self-destructive, whose expertise about nuclear warfare was both impressive and terrifying, whose commitment to preventing nuclear war was admirable, even as it was consuming her entire life and making normal relationships and activities almost impossible. Susan never married, never had children, never established the kind of stable domestic life that might have provided alternatives to her obsession with nuclear threats. And while there were many reasons for these patterns, including her difficulty forming intimate relationships with people who didn't share her preoccupations, I believe that the fundamental reason was her conviction that bringing children into a world threatened by nuclear warfare would be cruel and irresponsible, that long-term commitments like marriage and parenthood were foolish when civilization itself might not survive long enough to make those commitments meaningful. The end of the Cold War in the late 1980s and early 1990s, marked by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union and significant reductions in nuclear arsenals, was greeted with celebration throughout the United States and Western Europe. But Susan's response was more cautious and skeptical, reflecting her understanding that nuclear weapons hadn't disappeared but had simply become more dispersed, that the end of the bipolar confrontation between superpowers had created new risks of nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism that might be even more dangerous than the Cold War threats that had defined her entire adult life. Susan died in 2003 at age 52, not from nuclear war but from breast cancer that might have been treatable if she had sought medical attention earlier. But her lifelong focus on external threats had made her inattentive to personal health issues, and by the time the cancer was diagnosed, it had progressed too far for effective treatment. Her death was both tragic and somehow inevitable, the final consequence of a life that had been consumed by fears that prevented her from taking care of herself, from investing in relationships and activities that might have given her reasons to fight for survival when she was threatened by a disease that was actually affecting her rather than by weapons that might theoretically destroy civilization. I spoke at Susan's funeral, trying to explain to the small gathering of family members and peace activists who had known her work what Susan had meant to me and to the broader community of people who were concerned about nuclear risks, how her childhood trauma had been transformed into adult expertise that had educated and warned thousands of people about dangers they might otherwise have ignored, how her personal suffering had been channeled into public service that had probably prevented some of the nuclear conflicts that she had spent her life fearing. But even as I was celebrating Susan's contributions to nuclear disarmament and peace education, I was also mourning the waste of a brilliant life that had been damaged beyond repair by events that had occurred when she was too young to protect herself from their psychological impact, events that had been created by adults who had never considered how their political and military decisions might affect the children who would have to live with the consequences of superpower confrontation and nuclear terror. Susan's death marked the end of my most direct connection to the Cuban Missile Crisis and its aftermath, but it didn't end my awareness of how that event had shaped my entire generation, how 13 days in October 1962 had taught American children that the world was more dangerous than their parents had pretended, that the adults who were supposed to protect them were capable of making decisions that could end civilization, that growing up during the Cold War meant learning to live with existential threats that previous generations had never had to consider. Now, 61 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, I am 90 years old and among the last survivors of a generation that learned about nuclear warfare during childhood, that practiced hiding under school desks to prepare for atomic attack, that grew up with the constant awareness that human beings had invented weapons capable of destroying themselves and might use those weapons at any moment for reasons that children couldn't understand or influence. Most of my contemporaries have died, taking with them their memories of duck and cover drills and fallout shelter advertisements and the particular kind of anxiety that defined American childhood during the early decades of the nuclear age. The world has changed dramatically since 1962, with new threats and new technologies and new reasons for both hope and fear, but nuclear weapons remain, thousands of them still deployed and ready for use, still capable of ending civilization, still controlled by political leaders who might make the same kinds of mistakes that nearly led to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The specific fears that dominated Susan's life may seem outdated to younger generations who have different concerns and different threats to worry about. But the fundamental lesson of her experience remains relevant, that children are always vulnerable to the political decisions made by adults, that historical events beyond their control can damage young minds in ways that last for entire lifetimes, that trauma experienced during childhood can shape everything that follows. I think often about what Susan's life might have been like if she had been born 10 years earlier or 10 years later, if she had missed the Cuban Missile Crisis or experienced it at a different stage of psychological development, if she had been protected from nuclear anxiety by parents who understood better how to shield children from adult fears, if she had lived in a world where duck and cover drills weren't part of elementary education, and where 11-year-olds didn't have to consider the possibility of dying in nuclear warfare. But Susan was born when she was born into the world that existed in 1951, And she experienced the Cuban Missile Crisis when she was exactly the right age for it to cause maximum psychological damage, when she was old enough to understand the implications of nuclear warfare, but too young to have developed the psychological defenses that might have protected her from being overwhelmed by existential terror. Her life was both unique and representative, an extreme example of trauma that was experienced less severely by millions of other children who grew up during the Cold War, who learned to live with nuclear threats that their parents' generation had never faced, who developed the psychological scars that come from being raised in a world where civilization itself feels fragile and temporary. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days, but its effects on the children who lived through it lasted lifetimes, creating a generation of Americans who understood viscerally that human beings were capable of destroying themselves, that political leaders could make decisions that would end everything, that the future was not guaranteed but depended on the wisdom and restraint of people who had already demonstrated their willingness to gamble with human survival for strategic advantage. We learned lessons during those 13 days that no children should have to learn, gained knowledge that we couldn't forget and couldn't use constructively, developed fears that were perfectly rational but completely paralyzing. Susan Parker was one victim of nuclear warfare, killed not by atomic weapons but by the fear of atomic weapons, destroyed not by radiation but by the psychological effects of living under constant threat of annihilation, a casualty of the Cold War who never appeared in any official statistics about the human costs of superpower confrontation because her wounds were invisible and her death was attributed to natural causes rather than to political decisions made when she was 11 years old. But Susan was not the only casualty of the nuclear age, just the one I knew best, the one whose suffering I witnessed most directly, the one whose life and death taught me most clearly about the ways that historical events can reach into individual lives and reshape them permanently, can take children who should be thinking about games and friendships and learning, and force them to consider questions about human survival and civilizational collapse that would challenge the wisdom of much older and more experienced people. If you are young enough to have grown up after the Cold War ended, if you have never had to practice hiding under your desk to prepare for nuclear attack, if you have never experienced the particular terror that comes from knowing that civilization could end within minutes without warning, then you are fortunate beyond measure, luckier than my generation could ever have imagined being when we were children during the 1950s and 60s. But if you are old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you lived through those 13 days when the world came closer to nuclear war than it has ever been before or since, then you understand what Susan experienced and what it cost her. And you carry your own scars from that time when we all learned that the adults who were supposed to protect us were just as frightened and fallible as we were. The story of Susan Parker is the story of a generation that was traumatized by historical events beyond their control, that learned about nuclear warfare during childhood and never quite recovered from that knowledge, that spent their entire lives trying to prevent the kind of war that had haunted their dreams since they were 11 years old. It is a story about the human costs of political decisions, about the ways that international conflicts can reach into suburban neighborhoods and damage individual children, about the particular vulnerability of young minds to existential terror and the long-term consequences of childhood trauma that goes unrecognized and untreated. But it is also a story about courage and commitment, about the way that personal suffering can be transformed into public service, about the dedication of people like Susan, who channeled their fears into activism that may have prevented some of the nuclear conflicts they spent their lives worrying about. Susan's expertise about nuclear weapons and her passionate commitment to preventing nuclear war educated thousands of people, and influenced policy decisions that may have made the world safer, even if they couldn't make Susan herself feel safe enough to live a normal life. Most importantly, it is a story about friendship and love that persisted across decades, despite the obstacles created by trauma and fear, about the ways that caring for someone who has been damaged by historical events becomes both a privilege and a burden, about the responsibility that survivors have to remember and honor those who were casualties of conflicts that never quite became wars but that destroyed lives anyway through the anticipation of destruction that never came but that felt real enough to kill. Susan Parker died believing that nuclear war was still possible, still probable, still the most likely way that human civilization would end, and she may have been right about that, may have understood something about nuclear risks that the rest of us prefer to ignore, may have been the canary in the coal mine whose suffering warned us about dangers that we still haven't learned to address effectively. Her life was tragic and her death was premature, but her legacy lives on in the nuclear disarmament movement, in the peace education programs that teach new generations about the risks of nuclear warfare, in the arms control agreements that have reduced but not eliminated the threats that terrified her from childhood until death. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended 61 years ago, but the weapons that made it possible still exist, still threaten human survival, still require the kind of vigilance that Susan maintained throughout her adult life, still demand the attention of people who understand that nuclear warfare remains the ultimate threat to everything we love and value and hope to preserve for future generations. Susan's fears may have been excessive, but they were not irrational, and the world she worried about is still the world we live in, still dangerous, still capable of ending without warning, still dependent on the wisdom and restraint of political leaders who may not possess either quality when they need it most. This is what I learned from loving Susan Parker and losing her to the long-term consequences of 13 days in October 1962. That childhood trauma can last lifetimes, that historical events can damage individual lives in ways that never fully heal, that the price of political confrontation is paid not just by soldiers and diplomats, but by children who have to grow up in the world that adults create with their decisions about war and peace and the weapons that make both possible. If there is a lesson in Susan's story, it is that we must be more careful about the world we create for children, more aware of how our adult fears and conflicts affect young minds that are still developing their understanding of safety and security and hope, more committed to resolving international disputes before they traumatize another generation of children who deserve to grow up believing that the future is something to look forward to rather than something to fear. Susan Parker was 11 years old when the Cuban Missile Crisis began, and she was 52 when she died, and every year in between was shaped by those 13 days when she learned that the world was more dangerous than she had ever imagined, that the adults who were supposed to protect her were just as scared as she was, that nuclear weapons existed and might be used and could destroy everything she loved without warning or mercy. Her life was both a tragedy and a warning, both a memorial to the casualties of the Cold War and a reminder that the nuclear age is not over, that the weapons that terrified my generation still exist, still threaten us all, still require our attention and our action if we want to prevent them from claiming more victims like Susan Parker, who died not from nuclear war but from the fear of nuclear war, who was killed not by atomic weapons but by the knowledge that atomic weapons could kill us all.